everyone for one other conference. I'd like to the specific discussions. Some topics really important today in these days right now. I'll also thank you, our translator in Brazilian Sign Language, Bruna. And the Ethos Institute is in solidarity with all the victims of COVID-19. We regret the over 100,000 victims in Brazil right now. I'm Paula Oda, project coordinator of Ethos Institute. In this panel, we have the participation of Alexis Witkowski, Deputy Chief Technology Officer in the City of New York and professor in the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. And she wrote the book, The Information Trade, How Big Tech Conquers Countries, Challenges Our Rights, and Transforms Our World, in February of this year, and which will be the main topic of our conversation today. Well, we have been talking about smart cities for a while, or technology as a solution of everyday issues, and to keep in touch with your parents or to have facilities like Alexa's at your home. We have Boom right now. So, and these discussions about privacy has been minimized by the excitement of the facilities that the technology brings us. And so biometrics, facial recognition, and simple data have been collected all the time, and our steps generate some data that can be commercialized in some way. In the context of the pandemic, technological solutions serve to support companies and to adapt to their structures and business, and also governments to facing the pandemic and using research as tracing. But at the same time, it also puts some light on concerns regarding the privacy and the use that can be made of simple information that we make available without realizing. Alexis, and in your book, when you published it before the boom of the pandemic, by the time you call the big techs as a net states, in a way that they start to impact our physical life, actions in public and real life. And this is what then the other nations, and it was intended right now and during this pandemic. And companies like this have research that are often superior than the nations or the countries, and they are starting to form counter-terrorism efforts or open diplomatic offices in the United States and even in European Union. So, and you say in your book that the United States is a new phenomenon. So I really wish you would ask us how are they constituted and characterized? How does this context provoke change in power relations and powerful forms of abuse, threats to security, privacy, freedom, and also democracies? We are doing that. So, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you for welcoming me and for inviting me to speak today. As you mentioned, I wrote this book before the COVID pandemic, and I think that one of the surprises that I've seen is that all of the ideas from the book are just more relevant now than they were before. We see that countries have struggled to combat this disease and to provide care for their people. I know that Brazil has suffered terribly. The United States has also suffered terribly. And one of the things we've seen is that where the nation state, where governments have fallen down on helping to provide for basic needs, tech companies, these net states, as I referred to in the book, have stepped up. Back in March, when the pandemic first really took hold in the United States, the first people to ask their workers to stay home and to guarantee that their hourly wage workers would still get their income regardless of whether they could work or not, were not governments, were not public institutions, they were the tech sector. So Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, they all stepped up first and took action that we see happen in other countries on a national level. But we saw in the United States, it had to happen first with the private sector, with the tech sector specifically. And I think there's a few reasons that what they've done in the last few months is worth paying attention to, which I think will make more sense if I describe a little bit of the theory behind the book. So I think the easiest way to do this is to talk about why I wrote the book in the first place. I had been working at the State Department for the United States and working, that's like our foreign ministry. So we paid attention to global issues. And I was working in technology. So I was working on our social media accounts and YouTube accounts and all of the other tech stuff we were doing. And we started to see the rise of ISIS, recruiting people using social media. And it was this terrifying way of seeing terrorists spread their messaging, recruiting, organizing, and orchestrating attacks using technology tools that were part of our everyday life. And this really came to fruition in a terrible way in 2015 with the Paris attacks, which killed hundreds of people and were coordinated using social media tools. And in fact, one of the last arrests made in that case wasn't until months after the attack, and it was because one of the terrorists had posted something on Facebook that led the authorities to find him. And at that time I thought, well, what's going on? This is, governments are working together to catch these terrorists, but ultimately we're using the same tools and methods that we use to post pictures of our children or talk to our friends. We're using digital technology. And I thought there must be a role that digital technology platforms and companies and services play on the global stage, not just for conveniences of everyday life, but for national security, for diplomacy, and for many other reasons. So, but we didn't have a word to describe what these things were. They weren't non-state actors. That term kind of means bad guy. They're not nation states. Clearly, they don't have their own militaries and their own citizens, although there's something more to that I'll say about later. So I introduced this term net states, the idea that these massive tech companies that were expanding into areas that used to be in completely the domain of governments, like diplomacy and defense, in infrastructure and citizen services. And there's only a handful of them in the world, but they have so much power and influence, and they're only expanding it, that I think we need to pay attention, not like regular companies, but like we would other countries. So in 2015, I wrote this article about net states. And at the time, a few of my friends who read it said, I don't know if this is really quite plausible. This sounds a little bit crazy. So I actually put it on the shelf. I ignored it for a few years. And then another thing happened. In 2017, there was a series of terrible hurricanes that one hit Texas, which is a state in the south of the US, and one hit the island of Puerto Rico, which is a US territory. Texas was given a tremendous response from the federal government, even though there was fortunately not much loss of life. The Federal Emergency Management Agency sent 35,000 people to make sure that the power got turned back on and cell phone service got turned back on. Everything was working again. A month later, another hurricane hit Puerto Rico, and the entire island lost electricity. They lost cell phone connections. They lost internet connections. The island was devastated. And the US federal government didn't really do much. They sent about 50 people, and they didn't send funding for a very long time. But who did step up were tech companies. And this is where I started thinking, wait a second, it's happening again. Places that don't have the infrastructure for it. So within a day of the hurricane, Project Loon was sent to Puerto Rico to provide phone and internet connectivity. And then Elon Musk, who operates the car company Tesla, but also many other ventures, one of them is a solar power company, said, we can rebuild the island's energy infrastructure, start doing it for free, just to get the hospitals back online. And so within weeks, Elon Musk's Solar City and Power Pack companies went into Puerto Rico and put city grids and battery packs to the hospitals of Puerto Rico to get them back and operational again. So at this point, I thought, okay, it's happening again. Now it's not just defense and diplomacy, it's infrastructure and citizen services. So I wrote this article, I updated it, I got it published, and a few months later, I was asked to turn it into a book. So that's where the origin of the book came from, was seeing this happening in the real world and wondering, what's going on here? And one of the things that I've learned through the process of writing the book was that two things. One, technology is not bad by itself, and tech companies are not bad themselves. They provide tremendous advantages. We would not be having this conversation right now if it weren't for technology. We invite technology into our lives for a reason. It makes our lives easier, it makes our lives more convenient, it connects us to friends and family and work and services that we need. So one of the things I wanted to make sure with the book that I made clear was, this is not to say that technology is bad or doing something that we need to stop. What I am saying is that they have grown in power to the point where just simple regulations from the federal government are not going to cut it anymore. They have expanded way beyond their primary products and services into other sectors, so that even if you were to regulate, for instance, how Facebook monitors or shares the data it collects from its users, that's not going to change the fact that it has expanded into other areas as well. Facebook has a counterterrorism team because so many people have used its platform to organize terrorist activity and recruit new terrorists. And it's a massive team. It's larger than the US federal government's counterterrorism team at the State Department. Now, this alone should tell us something. We would think it was strange, most people, that Facebook has a counterterrorism team, because we've heard the stories recruiting on these platforms. But then think about another company. Think about Coca-Cola. Imagine Coca-Cola having a counterterrorism team. It would be crazy. Clearly, Facebook is not a company just like Coca-Cola. Neither is Google, neither is Microsoft or Amazon or Apple or a number of other of these. They're reaching into areas that used to be the sole domain of governments. And I'll give you a few examples. So Microsoft is an interesting one because most people still use computers that run Windows. If they're not running an Apple computer, they're using Microsoft products. And Microsoft also owns many other companies that we may not even think about as Microsoft company, like Skype or LinkedIn or Nokia. Microsoft a few years ago decided that they wanted to venture into diplomacy. So they said, the president of Microsoft gave a speech called the Digital Geneva Convention, saying, we as tech companies need to stand together and ensure that attacks do not happen using our tools and networks. And he got 30 some tech companies to sign this accord, the Digital Geneva Convention. A year later, Paris adopted this, and it became this global treaty that nation states signed along with net states. And hundreds of nation states and hundreds of net states signed a diplomatic treaty together as equals to protect what happens on the internet and try to keep people safe. This is maybe something that I find especially fascinating, having worked in diplomacy myself. But this just never happened before. Companies don't sign treaties, they sign trade agreements. And companies don't have ambassadors, they have, I don't know, liaisons or representatives. But a year later, Microsoft also appointed ambassadors to the EU and to the United Nations. They didn't have to do this. They already had plenty of ways to talk to the people at the United Nations through their business unit, the Global Compact. But they wanted a diplomatic avenue. They wanted a way to engage on the level of treaties. This is something that we see happen with governments, not companies. So there's something different happening with these companies than we've seen what's happening in government. Another thing that is, I think, really important to understand about net states is that they don't necessarily need government in the way that government needs them. All tech products and services, and indeed, they're just another client in some ways for tech companies, but they don't necessarily need to cater to any particular government because they operate globally. I'll give you another example. So all of the big tech companies, Amazon and Microsoft and Google, etc., have data centers all over the world. And sometimes they have to make sure that those data centers comply with laws. Other times they choose to negotiate terms so that they dictate how they operate their data centers. So Microsoft was given an order by the US Department of Justice to turn over emails from someone suspected of criminal activity about 5 years ago. And the servers that these emails were on were in Dublin, Ireland. Microsoft is based in the United States, in California. But what they said was, oh, even though we're an American company and we are doing business out of America, this evidence in America, it's in Ireland. So no, Department of Justice, you can't have it. We're not going to give it to you. And this went to a 5-year-long court case, which is still in appeals. It's a fight over precedent, over who gets to be in charge of deciding what happens with data when it crosses international borders. So this is another example of how net states can operate both with governments as equals, but in some cases above government, and saying that they're to decide what is proper, what is appropriate for their users. And in this case, not comply with a court order to turn over evidence, not because to protect a criminal, but because they were saying by virtue of people being users of our service, they have rights. And in the book about people as being citizen users, everybody across the world who uses Microsoft products, for instance, has the same rights according to Microsoft. They're citizen users of Microsoft. And the same applies for people who use Google, who use Facebook, or any of Facebook's platforms like WhatsApp or Instagram. These companies have policies that apply to people no matter where in the world you are. So you may be in a country that has certain laws, but according to these tech companies, these net states, you are the same in their eyes, whether you're in Brazil or in the US or in Sweden or somewhere else. So there's a lot of ways that these companies operate outside of and above the law, which is something that I think we need to pay attention to. The first thing I said about the book was I didn't want anyone to get the impression that I was saying that tech companies are bad. I don't think that they are. I do think they are extremely powerful. And like anything that is extremely powerful, they can do things that we do not want them to, or that would not be in our best interest as a people, as citizens of the world. And the only way that we can ensure that tech companies at this level, at the net state level, behave responsibly and with users' interests in their best interests in mind is if we are aware of what they're doing. Because they're not just services for networking with friends or posting photos. They are also, for instance, investing in the infrastructure of our cities. They are, for instance, if you look at Elon Musk's companies, the Power Pack and Solar City, they're providing electricity to dozens of states around the globe. And a lot of people don't really, if it's not a problem, a lot of people don't think about where this infrastructure comes from. If the road is level and paved and you can drive on it, great. If there's a problem with the road and you need to support it, then all of a sudden you think, well, who's in charge of this road? Same thing with your electricity. If you flip a switch and the light goes on, great. If you flip the switch and the light doesn't go on, then all of a sudden you might say, well, who's the electrical company? And wait, it's the guy that owns Tesla? It's the guy that's putting satellites into space? This is a very different kind of world that we're in, where tech companies are providing basic services that we used to rely on our governments for. So one of the other things that I think is really important for us to remember in all of this is that we have so much more power than we give ourselves credit for. We are citizen users of the net states, which means that if we collectively organized ourselves to push back against their policies that we don't like, they would pay attention. They would have to pay attention because without us, they are nothing. Without users, they are ghost towns and they can't survive. So this is something that I close the book with, this idea of hope that we have through our ability to organize ourselves collectively, so much more power than we give ourselves credit for. And so I hope that people, when they read the book, will feel empowered and like they have hope and choices in responding to these very powerful net states.
Perfect, Alex. I think you have a lot of information, and it's really important to see how they build this kind of power and how we can prepare to that. So I think this is the main thing about this discussion and how we can deal with that. And I think one of the questions that we have relating to the companies, they are doing big and it's how the precarious work and the overexploitation of work it's absorbed by these complexes of the big techs.
So just to make sure I understand your question correctly, you mean how to make sure that people's jobs are protected? Is that correct? Well, I'm going to just assume that that's what you meant. And it's interesting. In some ways, tech companies are doing better to ensure that people's jobs are protected than governments are. They are providing ways to work from home
yeah,
now that
not
we are
only
in
the people job, but we
pandemic.
have seen a lot of like the exploitation of the work, and related to all the big tech companies growing. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I understand. Yeah, no, this is one of the things that I think that we as citizen users have to push back against. That if we see the big tech companies exploiting their workers, then we need to let them know that this is something that we will publicly bring, that we will take away, we will influence them through the power of advertisers, really. So we saw this happen with Facebook this summer. There were a lot of people who were upset at Facebook for how they were handling misinformation related to coronavirus and other kinds of practices. And so a number of very powerful companies who spend a lot of money advertising on Facebook said, no more. We're going to cut you off. We're boycotting Facebook. We're not going to spend any money on advertisements on Facebook. And if enough companies join together to do this, it's all of a sudden gets Facebook's attention, and they have to start changing their practices. So they became much more careful after this happened. So I think we as citizens, if we see, for instance, these companies exploiting workers, then we need to figure out who we can pressure to take their money away from advertising with these firms, with the net states. So it will get their attention and they will change their practices.
It's okay. I'm sorry. I think I have a lot of wind today, so that's why my internet connection is not going too good. So
It's
really
okay.
sorry about that. And we have one question from from our audience here, that you said the big techs operates above the law. So the importance of controlling them and knowing what they do and about their infrastructure. And another author, Mariana Mazzucato, also points out that the big techs take advantage of the of important public resource, so that innovation comes from entrepreneurial state. Do you also identify that this on your investigations?
Absolutely. This is something that I think, we have to ask ourselves, why are so many of the big tech companies from the United States, for instance? And I think it's because the relaxed regulations around starting up new firms. America is very much a Wild West in a lot of ways. It's anything goes, anything is allowed in a lot of ways if you want to start a company. And a lot of these tech companies also are not paying taxes in the same way that a traditional company would. So it's very cheap to operate tech companies in the United States. So I think it attracts these kinds of massive growing tech firms for those two reasons. Innovation is, I think, part of the fact that people are quite free to do what they want and test new things. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing. A lot of good things have come from that freedom, but it also means that people are able to try new things that maybe are not in the best public interest. Sorry, I think my screen froze for a moment there. Sorry about that.
Perfect. And I'm just checking if you have No, we don't have. I have one more question to you, I think. One question that I have is what is the role of the companies in these relationships, the normal companies, or not the big techs, and in this relationship with them? Because nowadays I think they are really they are kind of hostages of their structures, right? What do you think about this relation?
So this is an argument that I hear occasionally about how big tech companies are just doing what their business models have created. They have to support themselves somehow through advertising and through monetizing user data. And so really, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just doing what makes sense for their business model. But their business models are subject to change. They're not written in stone. They're not bound by law. They could very easily make modifications in the way that they do business. I'll give you an example. So right now, for the history of the internet, we have become very accustomed to things being free online. Google search is free, email services are free, the technology that we use for video chat is free. A lot of the things that we find online are free. And so the argument is you can use any of these services for free, but you'll have to see some advertisements. And to make sure those advertisements are really relevant to you, we're going to collect some information about you so that we're not going to waste your time with advertisements for, I don't know, a sports car if you're a mother of 3, or makeup if you're a 50-year-old man. So we're doing this for you. We're doing this as a favor, almost. We'll make sure the advertisements are really relevant. But that's not where it ends. It is not just used to target our ads. They are also shared with data brokers, these companies that compile massive profiles on individuals so that they can be targeted through all kinds of different marketing efforts for different traditional companies, as you mentioned, sort of normal companies. There are other ways that tech companies can make their money. One of the things Apple, for instance, recently started doing is opening a subscription model for their music streaming services. It's called Apple Music. It costs something very small, maybe $5 a month, and you can download music as much as you want. Now, this is not to say that $5 is not an important amount of money, because these things add up. If you had Facebook charge $5, Apple charge $5, Google charge $5, etc., eventually it would get to be a more significant amount of money. But the point is, some people would choose to pay that. They would say, I would rather pay for my data to be protected than be given free services. So it would make it possible for these companies to still stay financially healthy, and users would have a choice. They would say, I would choose to keep my data protected. I would choose to allow my data to be shared, but still have it be free. And that choice is something we don't have right now. And this argument that it's not possible with the business models that are in place is just, I don't feel that it's very strong, because it is absolutely possible to introduce new measures and new ways to charge people for money. People do it all the time, and companies find all kinds of ways to charge us for money. So I think that it's definitely possible to do.
Wow. I think that there's one last question for us in a really quick way. What are the correlations between the fragility of democracies and advancing influence of sex?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat the question? You broke up a little at the end there.
Fala, eu vou fechar ela. Fechei, pode falar.
Hi, Alexis. This is Edison. The question was, what are the correlations between the fragility of democracies and the advancing influence of big techs?
Yes. Excellent question. So, democracy has been in decline for the last 15 years or so across the globe. And we've seen people losing their faith in democratic institutions and losing their faith in the democratic process. We've seen the rise of authoritarian leaders. We've seen attacks increase on democratic principles like free press and free speech. One of the things that's also happened in the last 15 years is the rise of net states. And we have had an increasing ability to choose who we engage with online. Instead of there being 1 or 2 or 3 news broadcasts that everybody in the country would pay attention to, there are now millions of sources for information, and not all of them are news. In fact, one of the things that's, I think, most challenging about the information environment that we're in today is that a lot of the information we see may look like news, it may look credible and trustworthy, but it's not only not trustworthy, it's not even created by a human. So there was a study done by the Infodemic Observatory that was founded to track COVID-19 related information. There's been about 300 million tweets about coronavirus since January. 300 million. Only 57% of them came from humans. 42% were from bots. Now, this is something that every country has to some degree, more or less. In the United States and Brazil, we have about the same amount of bot pollution, if you will. It's about 40%. So this means that anything that you see online, whether it's on WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, wherever you get your information from, about 40% of it isn't even generated by a person. Now, not all bots are bad. Sometimes bots are just people scheduling tweets to go out automatically. So for instance, a health ministry that wants to post updates about making sure people wash their hands, wear a mask, do things to keep themselves safe. That information might be scheduled to go out every hour. And that would be categorized as a bot because it's not a human posting it. But what's frightening is that we don't even know. There's no label that says this post came from a human or this post came from a bot. We have to just do our best to wade through it all and try to make sense of it. The reason this relates to the fragility of democracy is that we are flooded with information. It's exhausting to process it all. When we are feeling overwhelmed, we try to make ourselves feel more comfortable, safer, by gravitating towards what's familiar. And what's familiar are ideas and opinions that are like ours. It's harder to have a conversation with someone or even read about something that comes from someone who believes in something different. So the divide between people on one side of the political spectrum and people on the side of the political spectrum grows and grows and grows because we just become too tired to try to engage. And the algorithms that are used for search and social media only intensify the polarization. I'm only going to be shown news that already kind of agrees with what I believe. But if I look at, let's say, my cousin who has a different political perspective, his news feed is going to look completely different than mine. And we've done this experiment and showed how we don't see any of the same information. So the reason this relates to the fragility of democracy is that democracy depends on there being compromise, taking a wide variety of beliefs and a wide array of people who have many different kinds of needs and situations, and finding a way to find common ground. We don't have common ground right now. We have animosity and anger and distrust. And it's one of the things that is pulling at the fabric of our democracy. It's pulling us apart, and it is making it more difficult to find a way to reach across the aisle to those people who may be different than us. We are, I think, because of the incredible amount of information we see, exhausted. And to repair our democracy is going to take us to overcome that exhaustion and do some hard work.
Well, under my problems with connection, I think we have time to another question. So the last one, I think, right now. And we would also ask you to comment on the correlations between immigration and to extent to which big techs are able to go over the world. This was a big lobby when in the US the government began severely limiting immigration, asylum, and legalization. I hope that you heard about.
Yes, something about immigration. And I think I got enough to answer the question. So it is beyond ironic that we have this problem in America, because America is a country of immigrants. We were founded by immigrants beyond, with the exception of the Native Americans who were already in the country. Every single person in America is descended from an immigrant. And immigrants drive our economy, they drive our diversity, they drive our entrepreneurship, they drive so much of what's wonderful about America. I remember once going to, I used to live in China when I was in college, and I ate Chinese food every day because I was in China. And I realized, wait a second, there's no such thing as American food, really. We have food from all over the world. And I was so used to that, it confused me to eat just one kind of food every day. I felt lucky that I got to leave the country so I could come back to America and see just how special the immigrant experience was. So I think that the arguments that immigrants are taking away Americans' jobs are ridiculous. The evidence does not bear that out. The immigrants have a work ethic, typically, this is a broad generalization, but typically their work ethic is very strong and help to make the economy stronger, help to make these tech companies stronger. And a lot of the talent that you see in these tech firms come from overseas. Google and Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and Tesla and Facebook, they don't just want the best American minds. They want the best minds in the world working on their products. So when the US president announced that he was going to restrict immigration to the United States, there was this big backlash from net states to say it will damage our economy, it will damage our ability to innovate, it will damage the fabric of our country to attack and restrict access for immigrants. And it's also it's not even very well hidden. It's just, it appeals to a certain population of the United States people who feel afraid of anything that's different than what they know. When you look at the cities in the US that have a lot of immigrant people are very pro-immigration because they have experiences with immigrants that are positive. And when you look at people in the US who oppose immigration, they're very often in the center of the country where there are very small immigrant populations and they simply don't have the experiences. So I think it's bad for the country, it's bad for the economy, and I think that big tech has a role to play here, a responsibility to play here, to use their power and fight against it.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. I'm really sorry about my connection today, but it's really, really windy, so it's terrible here. So, but this is a very important thing to think about and to discuss. So we like to say thank you for you to join us here, and also to our audience, and also to our audience that join us today to take this conversation also. And so that's it. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Minerar na Amazônia é lapidar uma joia preciosa, joia que está embaixo do solo e sobre ele. Em plena Amazônia brasileira, a Alcoa desenvolve um projeto de mineração sustentável, da lavra do minério até a reabilitação das áreas, produzir bauxita de alta qualidade, superar todos os desafios e estabelecer um legado de sustentabilidade na Amazônia.
We are at a watershed moment in reshaping our world. Through our 4 international companies, we want to promote a change on a global scale. It is time to make a commitment to life. Today, we commit to address the climate crisis by addressing climate change and the preservation of biodiversity. We commit to help create a world that is human right and humankind by ensuring a better organization and a decent living wage for all our people. We commit to embrace circularity and regeneration by moving beyond a circular economic model to create more than we take. But we can't do this alone. We are calling on citizens, businesses, NGOs, investors, peers, governments to fundamentally change the system together. Let's become the generation who shift from we can to we did. Join the movement.
O novo coronavírus é um desafio. E a tecnologia da Petrobras pode ajudar muito neste momento. Nossos cientistas e nossa rede de parceiros estão buscando incansavelmente soluções rápidas para prevenção e tratamento. Redirecionamos a capacidade de processamento de 2 supercomputadores para a pesquisa de combate à doença. Juntos, nossa energia fica mais forte